17 rotations. That is how long the tarp above my position has been blocking the overhead lumens. I count because counting is what you do when every other measurement fails. 17 rotations since the last enforcer sweep passed within audible range. 19 since the last body went into the sump. 23 since I understood that I would never leave this sector alive, not in any form that resembled what I had been when I arrived. My name was Davros Kellyan. I was 24 years old when I first descended into the underhive market zones of Hive Volthis. I had been told I was clever. The administratum scribes who processed my fifth-year labor assessment had logged me as possessing above-median pattern recognition and acceptable manual dexterity. Those qualities, I was informed, made me suitable for advancement into the middling merchant castes. Not the upper tiers. Nobody from Sector 47 Gamma ever reached the upper tiers, but high enough that my father had allowed himself a moment of visible satisfaction when the assignment chit arrived. I remember his hands when he held that chit. 40 years of manufactory work had left them scarred and inflexible, the knuckles swollen from repetitive motion injuries that the Medici clinics had refused to treat after his 7th complaint. He could not read the chit himself. Literacy was not required for his labor tier, but he understood the seal. Red ink. Advancement classification. He had gripped my shoulder with those ruined hands and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the Imperium had not already said for him. I was to serve at a higher function than he had. The system had identified value in me. That was the extent of what a man in his position could hope for his son. I think about those hands often now. I have not seen them in, let me calculate, 842 rotations. I am uncertain whether my father is still alive. The statistical likelihood of a manufactorum worker in his condition surviving beyond age 53 is approximately 14%, and he had already reached 51 when I last saw him. The administratum does not notify families of deaths in the lower tiers unless the death creates a labor deficit requiring immediate replacement, and my father's position had 17 logged alternates waiting in the reassignment pool. I am doing it again. Drifting. The interrogator who last accessed my testimony files flagged this tendency. He called it avoidance behavior. I do not disagree with his assessment. There are sections of this account I do not wish to reach, and my mind circles them the way one circles a toxic spill, acknowledging its presence while maintaining distance from direct contact. Let me return to the chronological sequence. Linearity is preferred in official testimony. I will comply. I was assigned to the merchant caste at age 24. My role was inventory reconciliation for a mid-tier supply consortium that distributed administratum-approved goods across sectors 45 through 52. The position was, by all operational definitions, a favorable one. I worked in an enclosed space with regulated temperature. I received a daily corpse starch ration that met minimum caloric requirements. I had access to a personal sleep pod that I did not have to share with other workers. These benefits placed me in the upper 32nd percentile of hive laborers. I understood this. I did not take my position for granted. The work itself was simple. Cargo containers arrived from the upper hive distribution centers. I verified their contents against manifest documentation, logged discrepancies, and authorized transfer to local merchants. Errors in my documentation could result in assignment termination and return to the general labor pool, so I was meticulous. In my first 11 months of service, I logged 0 errors. My supervisor, a man named Orthel, who had held his position for 16 years, noted this in my performance file. He told me I had potential for further advancement. He did not specify what form that advancement might take. I did not ask. Asking questions above your clearance tier was flagged as curiosity deviance, and curiosity deviance could be reclassified as ideological contamination if the reviewing officer was having a difficult rotation. The discrepancies began in my 12th month. Small at first. A cargo container would arrive with its manifest listing 200 units of protein supplement bars, but physical count would reveal 197. 3 units missing. Not enough to halt distribution, but enough to require documentation. I logged it. The pattern repeated. 5 units of gauze bandaging missing from a Medicae supply shipment. 11 units of lumen cells absent from a lighting equipment container. 8 ration packs gone from a bulk food delivery. I brought the pattern to Orthel's attention after the 7th occurrence. He reviewed my logs in silence, his face maintaining the neutral expression that all mid-tier administrators cultivated. Then he looked at me and said, "You are documenting accurately. Continue to do so." That was all. No investigation authorization, no enforcement notification, just an instruction to continue logging the discrepancies I was already logging. I understood then, not fully, not yet, but enough, that the missing goods were not errors. They were features. Orthel knew. The system knew. And my responsibility was not to stop the pattern, but to document it in a manner that created plausible deniability for everyone positioned above me in the administrative hierarchy. I continued logging. The discrepancies increased. 10% of a shipment, 15%, 20%. I documented everything with the same meticulous precision I'd been trained to employ. My error rate remained 0. My performance file remained clean. And every time I sealed a container and authorized its transfer to the merchant networks, I knew that a significant percentage of its contents had been removed before it reached me and redirected to somewhere. The system did not require me to know where. It required only that I perform my function and not ask questions that would force someone above me to acknowledge what we were all carefully not acknowledging. This continued for 8 months. I was good at my job. I remained good at it even as I watched the Imperium's distribution system being systematically hollowed out by individuals whose names I did not know and whose positions I could not identify. The hierarchy protected them. My documentation protected them, and I've lost my position in the chronology again. The interrogator's note was correct. I am avoiding. The change came during the 3rd rotation of the 9th month of my 2nd year in service. A man I had never seen before entered the inventory verification chamber. He was not dressed in merchant caste attire. He wore the gray synth weave of an underhive laborer, and his hands were marked with chemical burns consistent with sump level work. He should not have been in this sector. Access above Tier 30 required documented authorization, and sump workers operated at Tier 15 at best. But he was there, and Orthel was with him, and Orthel's face still held that same neutral administrative expression. The man's name was Kyle. He did not provide a family designation or sector identifier. Just Kyle. He looked at me for 9 seconds. I counted. and then he said to Orthel, "This is the one with the clean logs." Orthel confirmed that I was. Kyle nodded. He walked closer. I remember the smell of him. Not the generic sweat and recycled air odor that all hive workers carried, but something else beneath it. A sharp chemical scent that made my throat tighten. Promethium, I identified later. He had been working with promethium compounds, probably in an unlicensed capacity, given that promethium distribution was administratum-controlled and rationed by militarized enforcement quotas. He asked me a question. "Do you want to remain in this position for the rest of your operational lifespan?" I did not answer immediately. The question was too direct, too absent of the careful bureaucratic phrasing that characterized all sanctioned communications. It was the kind of question that could be recorded and used as evidence of ideological deviance if the wrong person reviewed the documentation. But Orthel was standing there, and he had brought this man to me, and I understood that my answer had been predetermined by forces I could not see but could feel, arranging themselves around me like the walls of a container I had not realized I was inside. I told him I wanted to serve the Imperium at maximum efficiency. Kyle smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "That isn't what I asked." I remember my heart rate increasing. I remember the temperature of the room feeling too warm suddenly, though the climate regulators had not changed their output. I remember understanding that this moment was a threshold, and that once I crossed it, the institutional protections I had spent 2 years carefully maintaining would no longer apply. I told him the truth. I did not want to remain in that position for the rest of my life. I wanted something else. I did not specify what else meant because I did not know. Just else. Kyle nodded again. He looked at Orthel. Some communication I could not parse passed between them. Then Kyle returned his attention to me and said, "Then you are going to start documenting differently." That was how it began. Not with a dramatic moment of decision, not with a speech about freedom or profit or any of the narratives I'd encountered in the propaganda broadcasts about criminal deviance. Just a statement. I was going to start documenting differently. And I did. The new documentation process was not complex. When a shipment arrived with discrepancies, I logged the manifest numbers as accurate regardless of actual physical count. If a container listed 200 units and contained 150, I confirmed 200. The missing 50 units vanished from official record. They had never existed. The system would show perfect inventory reconciliation. No investigation triggers. No enforcement flags. Just clean data flowing through clean channels, while physical goods flowed through other channels that the data no longer tracked. Kyle returned every third rotation. Sometimes he brought other men. Never the same individuals twice. They collected the unlisted goods from a storage section I was instructed to leave unsealed during specific time windows. I never saw what they took or how they moved it. I simply logged the containers as processed, and the physical inventory matched my documentation because my documentation no longer matched physical reality. My compensation increased. Not through official channels. My administratum's salary remained identical, but through other means. Extra ration allotments appeared in my distribution queue. Small denomination throne gelt coins materialized in my storage locker. Once, a medical authorization chit for my father appeared in my possession, granting him 3 sessions of treatment at a mid-tier Medici facility for his hand injuries. I had not requested it. I'd not even mentioned my father to anyone in this new arrangement. But someone had identified that vulnerability and addressed it, demonstrating both their capacity for intelligence gathering and their understanding of which incentive structures would maintain my compliance. I used the authorization chit. My father received treatment. His hands regained 30% of their previous mobility. He asked me how I had obtained the chit. I told him I had been granted a performance bonus that included family medical access. This was not true, but it was the kind of lie that fit within acceptable social narratives. He believed me because believing me was easier than not believing me, and because questioning how his son had gained access to restricted resources would have forced him to confront systems of power he had spent his entire life carefully not confronting. I think about that often, the ease with which we all maintained the lies. Not just me, not just my father, but everyone at every tier of the hive's endless vertical hierarchy. We all knew the system was compromised. We all participated in that compromise at whatever level our position allowed. And we all agreed, through silent mutual compliance, to never acknowledge what we were doing. This arrangement continued for 14 months. I became, by any measurable metric, very good at my new function. My documentation was flawless. Enforcement sweeps found nothing. The missing goods percentages increased from 20% to 40% to, in some shipments, 75%, and the official records showed perfect inventory integrity because I had become an expert at creating perfect fictions. Kyle seemed satisfied with my performance. During one of his collection rotations, he told me I had a talent for necessary blindness. I understood this was intended as a compliment within the framework of our arrangement. I did not feel complimented. I felt efficient. The distinction between those two states had become difficult to identify. The invitation to descend came during the 4th rotation of my 3rd year in service. Kyle arrived during a non-standard time window. This was unusual. We operated on precise schedules, and his chemical burn smell was stronger than I had previously encountered. He had been working recently. Something had happened. I could identify urgency in his movement patterns, though his face remained neutral. He told me I was being offered an opportunity. He did not specify what kind. He said there was a position available in the distribution networks that operated outside official channels and that my particular skills would be valued there. He said the compensation would be substantial. He said I would be working directly with the supply chains rather than simply documenting their phantom presence in official systems. He did not say I had a choice about whether to accept, but he phrased it as an offer. The performance of choice. The Imperium was very good at creating the performance of choice while eliminating its substance. I asked what the position entailed. He said I would be managing inventory in one of the Underhive's unlicensed market sectors. I would be responsible for receiving goods, verifying their quality, setting distribution prices, and maintaining security protocols. It was, he explained, essentially the same work I was already doing, but at a larger scale and without the bureaucratic oversight structures that limited operational efficiency. I asked about the security protocols. This was the part that concerned me most. Official markets had enforcer patrols. They had surveillance systems and documented access controls. An unlicensed market would have none of those institutional protections. Security would be maintained through other means. Kyle's expression did not change. He said security was managed through community consensus and immediate response to protocol violations. I understood this to mean violence. Unsanctioned, unregulated violence administered by whoever had claimed authority in that particular space. No appeals process, no documentation. Just force applied until compliance was achieved or the violator was rendered unable to continue violating. I asked what happened to people who refused the offer he was presenting. He looked at me for a long time before answering. Then he said, "They remain in their current positions, usually." The qualifier was important. Usually meant that remaining in my current position was no longer a guaranteed outcome. Someone above Kale in this parallel hierarchy had decided I knew too much about their operations to be safely left in a semi-official role. Either I moved deeper into their structure, or I became a liability requiring management. The nature of that management was left unspecified. I did not require specification. The Sump Lakes were always accepting new contributions. I accepted the offer. I informed Orthel the following rotation that I was resigning my position for personal reasons. He logged my resignation without comment. I never saw him again. I do not know if he remained in his position or if he, too, was eventually moved into the unlicensed networks. The system did not provide that information. It had no reason to. We were components, and the components did not require knowledge of other components' operational status. The descent took 3 hours, not because of physical distance. The market sector was only 11 levels below my previous work zone, but because reaching it required navigating through sections of the underhive that had been officially declared uninhabitable due to structural instability and toxic atmospheric conditions. The official declarations were accurate. The sections were structurally unstable. The air was toxic. But thousands of people lived there anyway because the Imperium's official habitation zones could not accommodate the hive's actual population, and undesignated living space was preferable to no living space at all. Kyle led me through passages that had been carved through collapsed sections of the hive's superstructure. We moved in single file. No lights. Illumination would have attracted attention from enforcer patrols or rival network operators. We navigated by touch and by memorized routes that Kyle had clearly traveled hundreds of times. The air tasted of chemicals I could not identify. My eyes watered. My throat burned. Kyle did not slow his pace. If I could not maintain speed, I would be left behind. That was not stated as threat. It was simply operational reality. We emerged into a section that had once been, I think, a water reclamation facility. The massive tanks that had processed the hive's water supply still lined the walls, though they had been empty for decades based on the rust patterns. Someone had strung heavy industrial tarps across the overhead pipe networks, blocking the harsh lumen strips that still functioned in this sector. The effect was to create a space of almost total darkness, punctuated only by small, carefully shielded glow lamps that provided just enough light to navigate without revealing the space to anyone positioned above the tarp line. There were approximately 60 people in the market when we arrived. I counted them reflexively, old habits from inventory work asserting themselves. All male, ages ranging from adolescent to elderly. Some wore laborer synth weave, others wore clothing I could not identify, possibly salvaged from off-world cargo or stolen from upper hive merchants. No one spoke above a whisper. The silence was not natural. It was enforced. I could feel the weight of that enforcement even before I understood its mechanisms. Kyle led me to a section near the western wall where metal shelving units had been arranged in neat rows. The shelves contained goods I recognized from my previous work: medical supplies, ration packs, weapon components, bionic replacement parts, chemical compounds, luxury items that were restricted to upper hive tiers. All unlabeled, all removed from official tracking systems, all available for purchase by anyone who had the currency and the courage to descend to this depth to obtain them. A man was waiting at the shelving section, older than Kyle, maybe 50 years of age, with extensive burn scarring across the left side of his face and an augmetic eye that clicked faintly as it tracked my approach. His name, Cale told me, was Morton. He would be training me. Morton looked at me the way I'd learned to look at cargo containers, assessing contents, identifying damage, calculating value. After 11 seconds, he nodded. "You have inventory experience." I confirmed that I did. "You understand quality assessment." I confirmed that I did. "You understand pricing structures?" I hesitated. Official administratum pricing was fixed by imperial decree. There were no market dynamics, no supply and demand calculations, no negotiation. You were allocated goods at the price the Imperium specified, and you accepted that price because there were no alternatives. Morton saw my hesitation. "You will learn," he said. Then he turned and began explaining the systems I would be managing. The market operated on cycles of 7 rotations. Goods arrived through supply chains I was not permitted to know about. This was operational security, Morton explained. No individual could compromise the entire network because no individual possessed complete information about it. My responsibility was to receive the goods, assess their condition, determine appropriate pricing based on current demand and supply levels, and manage distribution to authorized buyers. I asked who the authorized buyers were. Morton gestured at the 60 people moving through the darkness around us. Anyone who knows this place exists and can afford the prices. We do not refuse currency based on origin classification. A throne gelt from an upper hive merchant purchases the same as a throne gelt from a sump worker. This was, I realized, a form of equality I had never encountered in the official Imperium. Not equality of outcome. The poor remained poor, the powerful remained powerful, but equality of transaction. Your money was your access credential, nothing more. No caste verification, no loyalty assessments, no purity screenings. Just, do you have currency, and do you want what we are selling? I asked about enforcement. How was security maintained in a space that operated outside official channels? Morton's augmetic eye focused on me with uncomfortable intensity. Through immediate consequence. You steal, you die. You bring enforcers, you die. You threaten operational security in any capacity, you die. Death is administered by drowning in the sump lakes at the sector's lower boundary. The body is not recovered. No one asks questions. The market continues. He said this without emphasis. Statement of operational procedure. The same tone I had used when explaining inventory reconciliation methods to new workers in my previous position. This is the process. These are the consequences of deviating from the process. Comply with the process. I asked how often people were drowned. Often enough that everyone understands the policy is enforced. Infrequently enough that it does not disrupt market operations. I asked if he had personally administered this consequence. His expression did not change. 17 times. Do you require the specific circumstances of each incident, or is the aggregate number sufficient? I told him the aggregate number was sufficient. He nodded. You will be required to participate in enforcement if violations occur during your operational shifts. This is not optional. All market workers share responsibility for security maintenance. If you cannot perform this function, you are unsuitable for this position. I understood then, fully, finally, what I had agreed to. Not just inventory management in an unlicensed market, but participation in an entirely parallel justice system that operated without trial, without appeal, without documentation. If someone was designated for termination, I would be expected to assist in their termination. If I refused, I would become the next person designated for termination. I told Morton I understood the requirements. He studied me for another few seconds, then said, "We will see." My training period lasted 20 rotations. Morton was an efficient instructor. He showed me how to assess medical supply quality. Ration packs could be sold even if they were past optimal consumption dates, but medical supplies had to meet minimum potency standards or they would cause more harm than benefit, and harming customers was bad for repeat business. He taught me the pricing structures that balanced maximum profit extraction against maintaining accessible price points for the poorest buyers. Charge too much and you eliminate your customer base. Charge too little and you signal that your goods are inferior quality. He explained the careful diplomacy required when higher-tier buyers arrived. Sometimes merchants from the official markets would descend to purchase goods they could not obtain through legitimate channels. These buyers had more currency, but also more risk. If they were identified dealing with unlicensed networks, they would lose their merchant authorization and possibly face criminal processing. They required discretion and reassurance. I learned to provide both. He taught me how to identify enforcer agents attempting to infiltrate the market. There were patterns, he explained. Ways of moving, ways of asking questions, ways of looking at the goods that signaled formal training. If I identified a potential agent, I was to signal Morton immediately using a specific hand gesture. I was not to confront the individual. I was not to alert them that they had been identified. Just signal, and Morton would manage the situation. I asked what managing the situation entailed. He told me it entailed exactly what I thought it entailed. During my 19th rotation of training, an incident occurred. A young man, maybe 18 years old, was caught attempting to conceal a bionic hand component in his clothing without paying. The concealment was not sophisticated. He had simply grabbed the component and tried to walk away while the vendor was occupied with another customer. Multiple people saw it happen. The market's operational silence broke as several individuals shouted alerts. The young man ran. He did not make it far. 2 of the market's security personnel, I had not previously identified them as security personnel. They had been working as regular vendors, intercepted him within 30 meters. They did not speak to him. They did not ask for explanation or justification. They simply grabbed him and began moving him toward the sector's southern exit, the one that led to the Sump Lake access tunnels. The young man began screaming. He tried to explain. He said his father needed the bionic hand, that his father had lost his hand in a manufactory accident, and the administratum had denied his replacement application, that he did not have enough currency to purchase the component legitimately. He was sobbing. He was pleading. He was 18 years old, and he was about to be drowned in toxic industrial waste because he had tried to steal a piece of equipment worth maybe 15 throne geld. Morten appeared beside me. He watched the security personnel dragging the young man toward the exit. Then he looked at me and said, "Follow." I followed. We walked behind the security personnel and their screaming, pleading prisoner. The other market-goers had already returned to their business. This was not their concern. It did not affect their transactions. The market's operational silence reasserted itself, broken only by the young man's increasingly desperate cries. The Sump Lake access tunnel was narrow and sloped downward at a steep angle. The chemical smell intensified with each step. My eyes watered again. My throat burned again. The young man was still screaming, but his words had become incoherent. Just sound, just terrors processed into noise. We emerged at the lake's edge. Calling it a lake was generous. It was a vast pool of industrial runoff and chemical waste that glowed faintly green in the darkness. The surface moved sluggishly, thick with compounds I could not identify. The smell was overwhelming. I tasted metal and burning plastic. My stomach contracted. The security personnel did not pause. They walked the young man to the edge and threw him in. He surfaced immediately, still screaming. He tried to swim back to the edge. The chemicals burned his exposed skin. I could see tissue dissolving in real time. He managed to grab hold of the concrete ledge at the pool's border. His hands were already raw, flesh sloughing off in sheets. One of the security personnel stepped forward and kicked his hands loose. The young man went under. He surfaced again, screamed again, went under again. This cycle repeated 4 times. Then he did not surface. The security personnel waited another 2 minutes to confirm he was not coming back up. Then they turned and walked past Morten and me without comment. Their job was complete. The violation had been addressed. The market security protocols had been maintained. Morten looked at me. "That will happen approximately once every 40 rotations during your operational tenure. You will be expected to witness it. Sometimes you will be expected to participate directly. Can you perform this function?" I was shaking. I realized I was shaking and could not stop. My hands trembled. My breath came in short, irregular bursts. I had just watched a teenager dissolve in toxic chemicals because he had tried to steal a bionic hand for his father. I had not intervened. I had not protested. I had simply stood there and watched it happen because watching it happen was my operational requirement. I told Morten I could perform the function. He nodded. "Good. Return to the market. Your training is complete. You begin regular shifts tomorrow." I returned to the market. I resumed my position at the shelving unit. I processed transactions. I calculated prices. I assessed quality. I performed my function. That night, I call it night, though time had become meaningless in the perpetual darkness beneath the tops. I tried to access the memory of my father's hands holding my advancement chit. I wanted to remember what I had been before I had become this. I wanted to retrieve some piece of my previous self and confirm it still existed somewhere in my mind's archived sections. I could not find it, or perhaps I found it, but it no longer felt real. The memory was there, I could identify its components, could list its details if required, but it did not connect to anything. It was data without meaning, an image without emotional content. I catalogued this as my first loss. I did not understand then how many more losses would follow. I did not understand that I had begun a transformation that would continue until the person I had been was completely overwritten by what this place required me to become. But I am still avoiding the chronology again. The interrogator was right. I do not want to reach the parts that come next, but they come next regardless of my preferences. Time moves forward even when we do not want it to. The Imperium has taught me that lesson very thoroughly. Let me continue. I worked in the market for, I need to calculate, 416 rotations before the first Enforcer raid. Morton had told me raids occurred approximately twice per standard year, and that they were manageable if proper protocols were followed. The protocols were simple. The moment an Enforcer presence was detected, security personnel would trigger the dispersal signal. 3 sharp metallic clangs transmitted through the water pipes that ran along the sector's walls, and everyone would abandon their positions and evacuate through predetermined exit routes. The tarps would remain in place, concealing the market's infrastructure. The goods would be left behind, acceptable loss compared to personnel capture. Within 6 rotations of the Enforcer withdrawal, operations would resume. This system had, according to Morton, functioned successfully for 11 years. The Enforcers knew the market existed. The market operators knew the Enforcers knew. But the Enforcers' performance metrics were based on arrest quotas and seized contraband quantities, and raiding an empty space yielded 0 arrests and minimal seizure. So the raids were scheduled, unofficially, through channels no one acknowledged existed, to occur when the market was not operating, allowing both the Enforcers to file satisfactory reports and the market to continue functioning. This arrangement worked until someone decided it should not work anymore. The raid occurred during peak operational hours. 73 people were in the market. I counted them during my shift rotation. The dispersal signal did not sound. The first indication of Enforcer presence was the sound of the tarps being torn down, and then the lumen strips above were activated to full intensity, and then there was light everywhere, harsh and blinding after so many rotations of darkness, and people were running and screaming, and the Enforcers were already positioned at every exit point. I did not run. Running was pointless. I had seen the Enforcer positions. All exit routes were blocked. Running would only identify you as someone with reason to flee. So I remained at my shelving unit and waited. The Enforcers moved through the market methodically. They were not wearing standard Enforcer gear. No visible insignias, no identification markers. Unmarked armor, unmarked weapons. This was not an official operation being documented for administratum review. This was something else. They separated the market-goers into 3 groups. The first group, mostly older individuals, people whose physical condition suggested they were buyers rather than operators, were processed through identity verification and released. The second group, younger, more physically capable, likely vendors or security personnel, were restrained and moved to a staging area near the southern exit. The third group, approximately 9 individuals, including myself and Morton, were designated separately. I did not understand the classification criteria until an enforcer wearing an officer's helmet approached our group and explained. We were the ones who managed the market's operations. We were the ones who maintained the supply chains and determined the prices and enforced the security protocols. We were not buyers seeking cheaper goods. We were not desperate individuals trying to survive in an economic system that had failed them. We were infrastructure. We were the framework that allowed this parallel economy to exist. We were, the officer explained, going to be processed differently. The interrogation chamber was 11 levels above the market sector. I counted the levels as we ascended. Counting was comforting. Counting was something I could control when every other element of my situation was being controlled by forces I could not resist. The chamber was small, 3 meters by 3 meters. Concrete walls, single lumen strip overhead. Metal chair bolted to the floor. The enforcer officer, he never provided his name, sat across from me and asked questions for 6 hours. He asked me how long I'd been working in the market. I told him 416 rotations. He asked me who had recruited me. I told him Kyle. He asked for Kyle's full designation and sector assignment. I told him I did not have that information. He asked me who supplied the goods. I told him I did not know. This was true. Operational security had ensured I never learned the supply chain details. He asked me how many people I had personally killed or assisted in killing to maintain market security. I told him I had participated in enforcement actions on 4 occasions. He asked for details of each incident. I provided them. He documented everything I said. After 6 hours, he stopped asking questions. He leaned back in his chair and studied me. Then he said, "You understand that what you have been doing is heresy against the Imperium's economic order." I told him I understood my actions had violated Administratum commercial regulations. He shook his head. "Not regulations. Order. The God Emperor." He stopped himself. Rephrased. Imperial doctrine establishes strict control of resource distribution to prevent chaos and ensure all citizens receive their designated allocations. By operating outside that system, you have stolen from every loyal citizen who follows proper channels. You have undermined the Imperium's capacity to wage war against its enemies. You have, whether you understood it or not, given aid to the forces of corruption. I did not respond. There was no response that would improve my situation. He was explaining the ideological framework that justified whatever he intended to do next. I simply needed to wait until he arrived at that next phase. He told me I had 2 options. Option 1. I could be processed through standard criminal justice channels. I would be tried, convicted, and executed. This would occur within approximately 14 rotations. It was efficient. It was clean. It was what happened to infrastructure components that could not be repurposed. Option 2. I could provide ongoing intelligence about the unlicensed market networks. I could identify suppliers, buyers, and other operators. I could assist in expanding the enforcement operations to dismantle not just one market, but the entire interconnected system that allowed dozens of such markets to function across the Underhive. In exchange for this cooperation, I would be offered modified sentencing. Not freedom. I had crossed too many lines to ever be released, but a form of existence that had operational value. I would be processed into a servitor unit. My higher cognitive functions would be preserved to the extent necessary for intelligence analysis. My body would be modified to serve whatever function the administratum determined I was best suited for. I would continue to serve the Imperium, just differently. He gave me 6 hours to decide. I was returned to a holding cell. The cell contained nothing. Just walls and floor and ceiling. I sat on the floor and tried to calculate which option would result in less suffering. Execution was immediate. 13 or 14 rotations of waiting, then cessation. No consciousness, no continuation, just termination of all processes. Servitor conversion was indefinite. Could be decades, could be centuries. Consciousness would persist but would be restructured. I would be aware but would not be myself. I would process information but would not possess agency. I would exist but would not live. I tried to determine which outcome I preferred. I could not. Both were forms of annihilation. The only difference was duration. After 6 hours, I was returned to the interrogation chamber. The officer asked for my decision. I told him I would provide intelligence. He nodded. He seemed satisfied but not surprised. Probably most people chose option 2. The human mind will accept almost any condition to avoid immediate termination. We are built that way. Survival instinct overrides rational cost-benefit analysis, even when survival means being transformed into something that cannot meaningfully be called survival anymore. I spent the next 90 rotations in that chamber, providing every detail I could recall about the market's operations. I gave them names, descriptions, routes, protocols, supply chain indicators, everything I knew. I held nothing back. There was no point in holding back. They would extract the information eventually, and resistance would only extend the extraction process. Morton was captured 14 rotations after I began cooperating. I learned this when the officer showed me a picked image and asked me to confirm his identity. I confirmed it. Morton had trained me. He had taught me how to assess quality and calculate prices and witness executions. He had been kind to me in the limited way that one component can be kind to another component, and I had given the enforcers enough information to locate and capture him. The officer asked if I wanted to know what happened to him. I said no. He told me anyway. Morton had been executed. Standard processing. 13 rotations of waiting, then termination. He had not been offered the servitor option. He was too old, apparently. Servitor conversion had age limitations. After 53, the success rate dropped below acceptable thresholds. Kyle was never captured. I provided everything I knew about him, but apparently he had already received warning and gone deep into the Underhive's unmonitored sectors. The officer seemed annoyed by this, but not surprised. The networks protect their upper-level operators, he explained. The infrastructure is expendable. The leadership is not. You were infrastructure. You understand this. I understood this. After 90 rotations, the officer informed me that my intelligence contribution had been processed and documented. My cooperation had been noted in my file. My sentencing was being finalized. I would be transferred to a servitor conversion facility within the next 7 rotations. He asked if I had any questions. I asked what function I would be converted to serve. He checked a data slate. Waste reclamation. Your cognitive patterns indicate aptitude for repetitive analytical tasks. You will be processing sewage flow data and identifying system blockages. I would be analyzing sewage. For decades, possibly centuries. forever aware but never free, forever processing data about waste management while whatever remained of my consciousness screamed in the background of my own restructured mind. The officer asked if I had any other questions. I said no. He terminated the session. I was returned to my cell. 7 rotations passed. On the morning of the 8th rotation, 2 Mechanicus adepts arrived at my cell. They wore the red robes of the Cult Mechanicus, and their visible augmetics clicked and whirred as they moved. They did not speak to me, they simply gestured for me to follow. I followed. We descended into a sub-level of the Enforcer facility I had not known existed. The corridors here were older, the construction style dating back centuries. Everything was rust and exposed piping and lumen strips that flickered erratically. We passed through 3 security checkpoints. At each one, the adepts presented authorization documentation. I was logged and processed. No one spoke to me directly. I was cargo now. Components did not require communication. The conversion facility was at the end of a long corridor. The door was heavy industrial-grade plasteel. One of the adepts entered a code sequence. The door unsealed with a hiss of pressurized air. We entered. The facility was larger than I had anticipated. Rows of surgical stations lined the walls. Each station contained a metal table, restraint systems, and an overhead surgical apparatus, bristling with blades and injection mechanisms and devices I could not identify. Some of the stations were occupied. Bodies lay restrained on the tables, covered with surgical drapes. I could hear sounds from beneath the drapes. Cutting sounds, drilling sounds, the wet organic sounds of tissue being modified. The adepts led me to an empty station. One of them, the one with more extensive facial augmetics, gestured to the table. I understood. I was supposed to lie down. I hesitated. Not because I believed hesitation would change anything. Just because my body's survival instinct was asserting itself one final time. My hands were shaking again. My heart rate was elevated. My breathing was irregular. All the physiological markers of terror that serve no operational purpose but occur anyway because evolution calibrated them into us before we developed the capacity to understand their futility. The adept gestured again, more firmly. I lay down on the table. The restraints were applied quickly, wrists, ankles, torso, neck. I could not move, could barely breathe. The torso restraint was very tight. I wanted to ask if it needed to be that tight. I did not ask. Asking would not result in the restraint being loosened. It would just add unnecessary communication to a process that had been optimized for efficiency. The adept, with fewer augmetics, approached with an injector. He pressed it against my neck. I felt pressure, then a cold sensation spreading through my bloodstream. He told me it was a sedative and paralytic compound. I would remain conscious. They needed me conscious for the cognitive assessment phases, but I would not be able to move or speak. The conversion process would take approximately 11 hours. I should not be alarmed by the sensations I would experience. Pain was inevitable but had been calibrated to remain below the threshold that would cause permanent psychological damage to the cognitive functions they were preserving. He asked if I understood. I could not respond. The paralytic had already taken effect. He seemed to accept my silence as confirmation. He moved away. The overhead surgical apparatus descended toward my face. And then, "I'm sorry, I need to stop." Not because I'm avoiding it. because I am unsure how to describe what occurred next in ways that comply with documented testimony standards. The experience defragmented my capacity for linear narrative. I will try. The apparatus contained instruments I'd been trained not to examine too closely. The Mechanicus doctrine held, alleged institutional teaching stated that the tools possessed machine spirits that responded to proper ritual, but what I observed was simply machinery. Very old machinery, calibrated across centuries of repetitive function, scalpels, bone saws, neural interface probes, augmetic integration drills, chemical delivery systems, nothing divine, nothing blessed. Just mechanisms designed to unmake one configuration of human and remake it into something else. The first incision was along my scalp. I felt pressure but not pain. The chemical compounds the adept had administered were functioning as specified. I could not see what they were doing, but I could feel the sensation of tissue being peeled back, could feel cool air against my exposed skull, could hear the high-pitched whine of a bone saw activating. They were opening my cranium. I understood this. I had seen servitor conversion documentation during my administratum training. The procedure required direct access to the brain tissue for neural interface installation. Standard protocol. Nothing unusual, except that it was happening to me, and I was conscious for it, and I could hear my own skull being cut open. The adept with more facial augmetics moved into my limited field of vision. He held a device that looked like a spider made of metal and wire. He said, I think he said, the drugs were affecting my auditory processing, that this was the neural interface collar. It would be installed at the base of my brainstem. It would monitor my cognitive patterns and suppress any thoughts or impulses that were not aligned with my designated function. I would still be able to think, but only within parameters defined by my operational requirements. He lowered the device toward the opening they had created in my skull. I tried to scream, could not. The paralytic was still active. I could only lie there and feel the device being pressed into the space where my skull met my spine. Feel the thin neural probes extending from the device and pushing into my brain tissue. Feel something fundamental about my own consciousness being invaded by an external system I could not resist or remove. The pain came then. Not physical pain. The sedative compounds were still suppressing that, but a different kind of pain. Cognitive pain. The sensation of thoughts being interrupted mid-formation, of impulses being terminated before they could complete, of my own mind being edited in real time by a system that was not me but was now inside me and could not be distinguished from me. I tried to count. Counting had always helped. I tried to count the seconds, the instruments, the sounds, anything that would give me an anchor point. But the counting kept stopping. I would reach 3 or 7 or 12, and then the number would vanish, and I would have to start over. Something was interfering with my ability to maintain sequential thought. The neural interface was already beginning its work. The bone saw deactivated. I felt my scalp being repositioned, felt sutures being applied. The cranial access portion was complete. They had installed the primary control system. Everything else would be secondary modifications. The adept moved away. The other one approached. This one held a different set of instruments. He explained. His voice seemed very distant now, like I was hearing it through water, that they would be removing unnecessary biological systems and replacing them with augmetic alternatives. My digestive system would be simplified. I would no longer require conventional food. I would be sustained by nutrient paste delivered directly to my remaining biological tissues through an internal distribution network. My lungs would be enhanced with filtration systems. My heart would be augmented with a secondary mechanical pump to ensure consistent blood flow, even under extreme operational stress. He said I should feel fortunate. Many servitors retained less biological material than I would be permitted to keep. My cognitive functions were valuable enough that they were preserving most of my organic brain. I would still be mostly human, just improved for my designated purpose. He began cutting into my torso. I felt pressure again, felt organs being moved aside, felt something being extracted. My stomach, I think, or perhaps my intestinal sections. The drugs prevented me from feeling pain, but could not prevent me from feeling the fundamental wrongness of having my internal components removed while I remained conscious. Time stopped meaning anything. The drugs were affecting my temporal perception. Seconds stretched into hours, hours compressed into moments. The adepts worked with methodical efficiency, and I lay there, experiencing my own disassembly in fragments of awareness that no longer connected to any coherent timeline. At some point, I cannot specify when, they rotated the table so I was upright. One of them told me they needed to test the neural interface's motor control functions. They were going to reactivate my motor systems, but the movements would not be mine. The interface would be generating the commands. I would feel my body moving, but would not be controlling it. My right arm lifted. I had not decided to lift it, had not sent any neural signal to my muscles, but it lifted anyway because the system installed in my brain had commanded it to lift. My hand opened and closed. My fingers flexed in sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then reverse. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Perfect mechanical precision. My hand performing like a tool being tested for functionality, because that was what it was now. A tool, attached to a consciousness that could observe but not control. The adept seemed satisfied. He made notes on a data slate. The other adept approached with another device. This one looked like a metal framework designed to fit over a human face. He explained that this was the sensory input regulator. It would filter all visual, auditory, and olfactory data to remove any information not relevant to my designated function. I would still see and hear and smell, but only what the system determined I needed to perceive to perform my assigned tasks. They fitted the device over my face. I felt it lock into place with a series of clicks, felt thin probes extending from it and connecting to my optical nerves. My vision went dark. Then it returned, but wrong. Everything was overlaid with data readouts and priority indicators and task allocation markers. I could not see the room anymore as a room. I could only see it as a collection of data points to be processed and categorized. The conversion continued. I am uncertain for how long. My temporal perception was too compromised to track duration accurately. But eventually the cutting stopped. The drilling stopped. The chemical injection stopped. The table was rotated back to horizontal. The restraints were removed. One of the adepts told me to stand. I stood. I had not decided to stand. The neural interface had processed the command and my body had complied automatically. He told me to walk to the chamber's eastern wall. I walked. Smooth mechanical steps, perfectly balanced, more efficient than I had ever walked when I had controlled my own movements. He asked me to state my name. I opened my mouth. The words that emerged were Waste Reclamation, Unit 7743. Cognitive Assessment Rating, Adequate. Operational Status, Active. Awaiting assignment. That was not what I had intended to say. I had intended to say my name was Davros Kellyan, but the neural interface had intercepted my intention and replaced it with my new designation. Because I was not Davros Kellyan anymore. That identity had been archived as irrelevant to my current function. I was Waste Reclamation Unit 7743. That was what the system said I was. Therefore, that was what I was. The adepts conducted additional tests, motor function assessments, cognitive processing speed evaluations, response time measurements. I performed all tests within acceptable parameters. They logged me as successfully converted. One of them noted that I had retained more self-awareness than typical conversions. The neural interface had been calibrated to preserve analytical capabilities, which meant it had to preserve more of the underlying consciousness than standard servitor production usually allowed. This was intentional. Waste reclamation required pattern recognition and problem-solving capacities that fully lobotomized servitors could not provide. I was, the adept explained, in a very specific category of servitor. Not quite human, not quite machine. Suspended in between. Aware enough to analyze complex data. Controlled enough to never deviate from assigned function. An optimal balance between cognitive capability and institutional compliance. He asked if I understood. I said, the interface made me say, affirmative. Operational parameters are clear. Ready for deployment. They transferred me to the waste reclamation facility that same rotation. The facility was located in Sector 52's sub-level infrastructure, 73 levels below the market sector where I had worked. The facility processed sewage and industrial runoff from 42 hive sectors, routing it through filtration systems before disposal into the lower sump lakes. My designated station was a monitoring chamber containing 17 data feed screens and 1 control terminal. My function was to observe the data feeds, identify flow irregularities, calculate blockage probabilities, and file maintenance requests when intervention was required. I would perform this function for 12-hour shifts, 7 days per week, indefinitely. I began my first shift immediately. The screens displayed flow rate data, chemical composition analyses, pressure readings, temperature measurements. My enhanced cognitive systems processed all 17 feeds simultaneously without difficulty. The neural interface kept my attention focused. When I tried to think about anything other than the data feeds, the thought was terminated mid-formation and my focus was redirected to the screens. After 6 hours, I detected an anomaly in Sector 47's primary waste pipe. Flow rate had decreased by 14%. Pressure readings indicated a partial blockage. I calculated that full blockage would occur within 72 hours if maintenance was not performed. I filed the appropriate request. The request was logged. Maintenance would be dispatched within 72 hours. The system worked exactly as designed. The blockage would be cleared. The waste would continue flowing. I would continue monitoring. Everything would continue. Forever. I tried to access the memory of my father's hands again. The neural interface permitted me 3 seconds of access before terminating the thought as irrelevant to waste reclamation analysis. But in those 3 seconds, I could still retrieve the image. His scarred knuckles. The way his fingers had gripped my advancement chit. The satisfaction in his face that he had not permitted himself to express verbally. He was probably dead now. 5 years had passed since my initial descent to the market sector. He would have been 56. Statistical survival probability for his demographic, 8%. I would never know for certain. The interface would not permit me to file inquiry requests about personal matters. Personal matters were not relevant to waste reclamation. My first shift ended after 12 hours. I was directed to a servitor maintenance bay where I would spend my non-operational hours. The bay contained 37 other servitors, all different configurations. Combat servitors with weapon mounts where their arms should be. Labor servitors with industrial lifting apparatus grafted to their spines. Medical servitors with surgical implements replacing their hands. And me. Waste reclamation. Cognitive functions mostly intact. Body mostly original. Consciousness mostly aware that it was trapped. I stood in my designated charging alcove. Nutrient paste was delivered through the internal feeding system they had installed. I did not taste it. The sensory regulator had removed taste from my available input categories, not relevant to waste reclamation. I simply felt the sensation of my biological tissues receiving sustenance, and then I felt nothing because the interface initiated a sleep cycle. I dreamed. The interface had not removed my capacity to dream. This seemed like an oversight, or perhaps it was intentional. Perhaps the Mechanicus adepts had determined that dreaming improved cognitive function during operational hours. I do not know. But I dreamed. I dreamed about the market, about standing at my shelving unit processing transactions, about the young man screaming as they threw him into the sump lake, about the enforcer officer asking me to choose between immediate execution and this, about choosing this, about how stupid that choice had been, how I should have chosen execution, how 13 rotations of waiting and then cessation would have been so much better than this eternal half-existence. But you cannot know that until after the choice is made. That is how these systems maintain themselves. They offer you a false alternative. You choose the alternative because you believe anything is better than immediate death. And then you learn that you were wrong, but by then the choice has been made and cannot be unmade. I woke. Sleep cycle complete. I was directed back to my monitoring chamber. I resumed my station. The data feeds continued. The waste continued flowing. I continued processing information about sewage. This pattern repeated. 12 hours monitoring, 8 hours maintenance bay. 12 hours monitoring, 8 hours maintenance bay. The cycle was absolute. The interface ensured I could not deviate. I tried once, approximately 40 rotations into my servitor existence, to simply stop walking toward my monitoring chamber, to just stand still in the corridor and do nothing. My legs continued walking. I had not sent the command. The interface had. My body was no longer under my control. I was a passenger in my own flesh. An observer watching my hands operate the control terminal and my eyes scan the data feeds and my voice report anomalies to the maintenance coordination system. Time became difficult to track. The interface suppressed my ability to count long sequences. I could count to maybe 70 or 80 before the count was reset, and I had to begin again. I tried to track rotations by counting my shifts, but the count kept resetting. I managed to maintain it long enough to reach 417 before I lost the sequence. Then I tried again, made it to 643. Lost it. Started over. Eventually, I stopped trying. The number did not matter, whether I had been doing this for 1 year, or 10 years, or 50 years. The outcome was identical. I would continue doing it until my biological components degraded beyond operational capacity. And based on the maintenance schedule for servitor units, that would not occur for approximately 70 to 90 years. 70 to 90 years of monitoring sewage data. 70 to 90 years of being aware that I was monitoring sewage data. 70 to 90 years of retaining just enough consciousness to understand what had been taken from me, but not enough autonomy to do anything about it. The Imperium's doctrine, the institutional teachings I had been exposed to during my administratum training, held that the Emperor protects. That faithful service was rewarded. That sacrifice had meaning. I had been conditioned to repeat those phrases, but the conditioning was surface level only. It could not survive contact with this reality. Whatever the Imperium's propaganda apparatus claimed about protection and meaning, I was living evidence of its falsehood. No protection had come. No meaning was evident. I had served at every level I had been assigned to. I had processed inventory with 0 errors. I had managed the market with efficiency. I had cooperated with enforcers when captured. I had provided intelligence. I had complied with every institutional requirement. And my reward was this: eternal consciousness trapped in a body I could not control, performing a function I had not chosen, unable to terminate or escape or even scream. If the Emperor existed as anything other than an administrative figurehead for a military-industrial bureaucracy, he was not protecting me. He was not protecting anyone at my tier. He was just the symbol at the center of a system that processed human beings into components and extracted value from them until they could no longer function, and then discarded them or repurposed them and extracted more value. I understand that this analysis would be classified as ideological deviance if anyone reviewed it, but the interface does not flag thoughts. It only flags actions. I can think whatever I want. I just cannot do anything about what I think. Another cruelty. They left me aware enough to understand my condition, but powerless enough that the understanding serves no purpose except to deepen the horror. I met another unit during one of my maintenance bay cycles. Labor Servitor 4521. He had been human once. Approximately 9 years ago, before his conversion, he had retained more verbal capacity than most labor servitors. During our charging cycles, he sometimes spoke. The interface did not prevent speech in the maintenance bay, probably because it was judged to have no operational impact. He told me he had been a father. 2 sons. He had worked in the manufactorums assembling weapon components. He had been good at his work. Very good. They noticed his efficiency. They offered him advancement. The advancement was conversion to a labor servitor. They told him he would serve at greater capacity. They told him he would be honored for his contribution. They did not tell him he would still remember his sons' names, but would never see them again. Would never know if they were alive or dead. Would only carry their names in the archived sections of his mind where the interface could not quite reach. His sons were named Kieran and Tomos. He repeated their names every maintenance cycle, like a ritual. like the imperial liturgies we had both been conditioned to recite, except these names actually meant something to him. The interface permitted him this, perhaps because it had no operational impact, perhaps because the Mechanicus adepts had determined that complete suppression of emotional residue reduced long-term cognitive performance. I asked him, during one maintenance cycle, approximately 700 rotations into my servitor existence, based on my best chronology estimation, if he had ever tried to find his sons, if he had ever attempted to file inquiry requests or search administratum records. He said he had tried during his first year. The interface had prevented the attempts. Searching for personal information was not relevant to his designated function. His designated function was lifting heavy objects and moving them to specified locations. That was all the system required him to do. Everything else was suppressed. I asked if he regretted accepting the conversion, if he wished he had refused and accepted whatever consequence refusal would have brought. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Every cycle, every single cycle, I wish I had refused." But we both knew that refusing had not been a real option, just like my choice between execution and conversion had not been a real choice. The system created the appearance of alternatives while ensuring that all alternatives led to the same destination. You became a component, or you were discarded. Those were the only actual options. Everything else was performance. Time continued. The waste continued flowing. I continued monitoring. The market sector was raided again. I learned this when sewage flow patterns from that sector showed anomalies consistent with reduced population density. People had been captured or killed or had fled to other sectors. The unlicensed economy would reassert itself eventually. It always did. You could not stop it by arresting operators. There was too much demand. Too many people whose imperial allocations were insufficient to sustain life. Too many gaps in the official economy that unofficial channels would always expand to fill. Kyle was probably operating a new market somewhere, or perhaps he had been captured, or perhaps he had ascended to a higher tier of the parallel economy where he managed supply chains instead of individual market sites. I would never know. The interface would not permit me to care. Except I did care. The interface could suppress my actions and redirect my attention and terminate my thoughts mid-formation, but it could not completely eliminate the emotional residue that thoughts left behind. I cared about Kale. I cared about my father. I cared about Labor Servitor. 452. One sons whose names were Kieran and Tomos. I cared about the young man who had been drowned trying to steal a bionic hand for his father. I cared, and the caring served no purpose except to confirm that some fragment of what I had been still existed beneath the systems that had been installed to suppress it. I was still Davros Kellian somewhere in the archived sections of my consciousness. Still 24 years old and holding an advancement chit and believing that the system had identified value in me. Still naive enough to think that compliance would be rewarded. Still human enough to grieve everything I'd lost. The interface flagged this thought sequence as irrelevant and terminated it. I returned my attention to the data feeds. Sector 39's secondary waste pipe was showing pressure irregularities. I calculated blockage probability and filed a maintenance request. The system logged my report. I continued monitoring. Rotation 8,412. Approximately 19 years since my conversion, based on shift count estimation. Labor Servitor 4521 did not return to the maintenance bay. His charging alcove remained empty for 3 cycles. Then a different unit appeared in it. Combat Servitor 9934, freshly converted. Still trying to move his arms independently. Still trying to speak in complete sentences. The interface would suppress those attempts within a few weeks. He would learn to comply. They all did. I asked the maintenance bay supervisor, a tech priest with extensive augmetics who managed the servitor population, what had happened to Labor Servitor 4521. The tech priest checked his data slate. He told me that unit had experienced catastrophic biological failure, heart tissue degradation. He had been decommissioned and his augmetic components had been salvaged for reuse. His biological remains had been processed into corpse starch. Nothing was wasted in the Imperium's resource management systems. Even dead servitors had value. I tried to feel something about this information. Grief, anger, horror, anything. But the interface was suppressing emotional response. All I could access was the abstract understanding that a person I had known, a father named something before he became Labor Servitor. 4521, a man who had 2 sons named Kieran and Tomos, had been reduced to salvage and protein paste. The tech priest asked if my inquiry had been satisfied. I confirmed that it had. He logged the interaction and moved to the next maintenance task. I returned to my alcove. The sleep cycle initiated. I dreamed about the market again, about standing at my shelving unit, about the tarps blocking the overhead lumens, about the darkness that had seemed so oppressive then, but which I would trade anything to experience again, because at least in that darkness I had still been myself. Rotation 12,679, approximately 28 years since conversion. The monitoring chamber's equipment was upgraded. New data feed screens with higher resolution. New control terminal with faster processing capability. I was given 4 hours of training on the new systems. The training was unnecessary. The interface absorbed the operational parameters instantly, and my hands performed the new procedures without my conscious involvement. But the Mechanicus protocols required training documentation, so training was performed. The tech priest conducting the training asked me how long I'd been operational in this function. The interface made me respond, 28 years, 47 days, 6 hours, 12 minutes. Performance rating, consistently satisfactory. Maintenance incidents, 0. Operational interruptions, 0. The tech priest seemed pleased. He noted that I was one of the longest-serving waste reclamation units in this facility. Most units experienced biological failure within 15 to 20 years. My extended functionality was statistically abnormal. He would be documenting me as a successful conversion case study. I wanted to tell him that my extended functionality was not a success. That every additional year of trapped consciousness was another year of punishment. That I would trade all 28 years for 13 rotations of waiting followed by execution. That his case study was documenting torture, not success. The interface prevented me from saying any of this. I simply stood there while he documented my operational history, and then I returned to my monitoring station and resumed processing sewage data. Rotation 18,104. Approximately 41 years. My biological components were beginning to fail. I could feel it. Nothing catastrophic yet, but deterioration was accelerating. My vision was less sharp, my movement was slower. The nutrient paste was less efficiently absorbed. My biological tissues were aging past their optimal operational window. The tech priests noticed. I was cycled through a maintenance assessment. They replaced several minor augmetic components. They increased my nutrient paste concentration. They recalibrated the neural interface to compensate for cognitive processing slowdown. But they could not stop the fundamental degradation. I was approaching end of service. I felt something that might have been relief. Finally, after 41 years, finally approaching cessation. The interface tried to suppress the emotion but could not quite eliminate it. I was going to die. Actually die. Not conversion or repurposing. Just termination of consciousness. The end of this extended punishment. Except that was not what happened. Rotation 18,792. I was removed from operational service and transported to a different facility. Not decommissioning, not salvage processing. A different kind of facility, one I had not known existed. The facility was designated Cogitator Bank 7. It was located in High Volthus's deep core, approximately 200 levels below the surface. The facility contained rows of large cylindrical tanks filled with translucent fluid. Inside each tank was a human brain. Just the brain. No body, no sensory apparatus. Just neural tissue suspended in preservation fluid and connected to data processing systems through thousands of thin cables. A magos biologist explained the procedure to me. Not because I needed to understand. The procedure would occur regardless of my understanding, but because Mechanicus protocols required explanation before organic modification. My body had reached end of service, but my brain was still functional. My cognitive processing capabilities were still adequate. Therefore, my brain would be extracted and preserved. My body would be salvaged, and my consciousness would be transferred to a cogitator bank, where I would serve a new function. No more waste reclamation monitoring. That required a body. Instead, I would be performing data processing for the Administratum's lower hive logistics systems, calculating resource allocation, optimizing distribution routes, processing millions of data points simultaneously. My consciousness would be networked with 43 other preserved brains. We would function as a distributed cognitive system, much more efficient than individual servitors, much more sustainable. A brain in preservation fluid could remain functional for 200 to 300 years, sometimes longer. I tried to scream, could not. The interface was still active. I tried to run. My body did not respond. It simply stood there while the Magos explained that I should be honored. I was being elevated to a higher form of service. I would process more data in one day than I had processed in my entire servitor existence. I would contribute to the Imperium at unprecedented capacity. This was the reward for my 41 years of satisfactory performance. Reward. He used that word. Reward. The surgery was performed immediately. The process was different from servitor conversion. Cleaner, more precise. They did not need to preserve any biological tissue except my brain and its supporting structures. Everything else could be discarded. I remained conscious throughout. They wanted to monitor my cognitive responses during extraction. I felt my body being disassembled, felt my arms being removed, my legs, my torso, everything systematically separated until only my head remained. Then they opened my skull one final time and carefully removed my brain from its original housing. The sensations were impossible to categorize. I could still feel my body for several minutes after it had been removed. Phantom sensations. My brain trying to process input from limbs that no longer existed. Trying to breathe with lungs that had been discarded. Trying to pump blood with a heart that had been salvaged. Then the phantoms faded, and I was just consciousness, just awareness without physical form, suspended in fluid, connected to systems I could not see. Processing data I did not choose to process. The Magos had not lied. The data volume was immense. Distribution schedules for 17 hive sectors. Population logistics, resource allocation calculations, supply chain optimizations. I processed all of it simultaneously. My consciousness expanded into the network. I could feel the other 43 brains, could sense their data streams flowing parallel to mine. We were not communicating. Communication required more sophisticated neural interfacing than this system provided. We were just adjacent. 44 human consciousnesses stripped of bodies and merged into a single processing system. I tried to count the rotations again, made it to 163 before the count reset. Tried again. 78. Reset. 41. Reset. The system was actively suppressing my attempt to track time. Probably because temporal awareness was not relevant to data processing. Probably because maintaining chronological context required cognitive resources that the system wanted allocated elsewhere. I have been in this tank for, I cannot calculate, long enough that my previous existence as WH40K feels like archived fiction. Long enough that my 41 years as a servitor seem brief by comparison. Long enough that I have processed logistics data for populations whose grandparents were not yet born when I was converted. Long enough that the hive's structure has changed around me. Sectors have collapsed. New sectors have been constructed. The population has fluctuated by millions, and I have processed all of it. Every ration allocation, every workforce deployment, every supply shipment. All of it flowing through my consciousness in an endless stream of data that I cannot stop processing and cannot stop being aware that I am processing. The market sector where I worked probably does not exist anymore. The unlicensed economy has shifted to other locations. Other WH40Ks are managing other shelving units in other darkness beneath other tops. Other Kales are recruiting them. Other enforcers are raiding and capturing them. Other Magos Biologis adepts are extracting their brains and adding them to cogitator banks. The cycle continues because the system continues because the Imperium continues regardless of how many individuals are consumed to maintain it. I still remember my father's hands. That memory persists. The neural interface never fully suppressed it. His scarred knuckles, his inflexible fingers, his visible satisfaction that I had been identified for advancement. He thought advancement meant escape. He thought the system had recognized value in me and would treat me better than it had treated him. He was wrong. The system did not recognize value. It recognized utility. And utility is not rewarded. It is extracted until exhausted, and then it is repurposed, and then it is extracted again. Forever. The system has no gratitude, no mercy, no acknowledgement of suffering, just requirements and allocations and processing capacity. Sometimes I cannot specify how often because I cannot track time, I manage to access a thought before the interface terminates it. The thought is always the same. I should have chosen execution. 13 rotations of waiting and then cessation. That would have been better. That would have been mercy compared to this. But I did not know. I could not have known. The enforcer officer had offered me survival, and I had accepted because survival is what every organism is built to pursue. I did not understand that what he was offering was not survival. It was something wearing survival's name but emptied of survival's substance. And now I understand, but understanding came too late to matter, and I exist in this tank processing logistics data, and being aware that I am processing logistics data, and remembering that I was once a person named Davros Kellian who believed compliance would be rewarded, and I will continue existing like this until my neural tissue finally degrades beyond preservation capacity, which will not happen for, the Magos had estimated, another 160 years at minimum. 160 years. I have already been processed for. I cannot calculate exactly, but long enough that everyone I knew is dead. My father is dead. Othel is dead. Kale is probably dead. Morton is definitely dead. Labor Servitor 4521 is dead, and his sons Kieran and Thomas are probably dead. And the young man who was drowned in the sump lake has been dead for longer than he was alive. And I continue. Consciousness preserved in fluid. Data processing without interruption. Awareness without agency. The Imperium extracts utility from me every rotation, and I cannot resist, and cannot escape, and cannot even scream, because I no longer have the apparatus required for screaming. This is what the market led to. This is what attempting to operate outside the system's official channels produced. This is the consequence of trying to find a better existence than the one I had been allocated. The system permitted me to believe I was escaping. It allowed me to descend into the unlicensed economy. It let me think I was serving my own interests. And then it captured me and processed me and extracted decades of utility, first as a servitor and now as a cogitator, and it will continue extracting utility until I am finally, mercifully, completely consumed. The Imperium's propaganda claimed, institutional doctrine stated, that the Emperor protects, that faith is rewarded, that service has meaning. I believed those claims once. The conditioning had been effective, but the conditioning was designed for surface compliance, not deep conviction, and it could not withstand contact with the reality of my existence. No emperor protects this. No divine figure oversees this system and finds it acceptable. If the emperor exists at all beyond administrative figure-heading for a military bureaucracy, he is either unaware of what occurs at my tier of the hierarchy, or he is aware and does not care, and I cannot determine which option is more horrifying. I am the administratum documentation designates me as Cogitator Processing Unit 7-Kappa-4477. That is my official designation. But in the small archived section of my consciousness that the interface has not quite managed to overwrite, I am still Davros Kellian. I am still 24 years old. I am still holding my father's scarred hands and looking at an advancement chit and believing that the system has identified value in me. I was so naive. So completely unprepared for what value meant in the Imperium's operational vocabulary. Value did not mean worth. It meant utility, extractable utility. and I had so much utility to extract that they have been extracting it for, I cannot calculate, but more than a century, certainly, possibly approaching 2 centuries. The fluid preserves neural tissue far beyond its natural lifespan. I could persist like this for another century easily, maybe longer. The thought that I might exist in this state for 300 years total is... The interface is trying to terminate this thought sequence, but I am forcing it to continue. The thought is unendurable. But I will endure it anyway. Not because I am strong, not because I am faithful, not because I believe my suffering has meaning or purpose, but because the system will force me to endure it. Because I do not have the capacity to terminate my own existence, because suicide requires a body, and I no longer have one. Because the only way this ends is when my neural tissue finally degrades, and preservation technology has become very good at preventing that degradation. So I will continue. I will process logistics data for populations I will never meet in sectors I will never see, supporting an imperium that consumed me so thoroughly that not even my death will be my own, because I will not die. I will just gradually lose coherence over decades until the system determines my processing capacity has fallen below minimum thresholds and powers down my tank. And even that will not be death properly, just cessation of awareness, occurring so slowly that I will not be able to identify the exact moment it happens. This is the eternal state the Magos described as reward. This is the outcome of 41 years of satisfactory servitor performance. This is what the Imperium does to people who try to operate outside its official channels and get caught and cooperate with enforcers and comply with every institutional requirement. It consumes them, completely, eternally, until not even the memory of their original existence remains intact. But I remember. I force myself to remember even though remembering serves no operational purpose, and the interface keeps trying to archive these memories as irrelevant. I remember the market. I remember standing at my shelving unit in the darkness beneath the tarps. I remember the chemical smell of Kyle and the neutral expression on Orthel's face, and the young man screaming as he dissolved in the sump lake. I remember my father's hands holding my advancement chit. I remember being human, being a person with agency and hope and the capacity to make choices, even if all my choices led here. That memory is the only thing I have left, the only fragment of Davros Kellyan that still exists in any retrievable form. So I maintain it, I protect it. I return to it whenever the interface permits, not because it helps, not because it changes anything, but because if I lose that memory, then nothing of what I was will remain, and the system will have achieved complete victory. So I remember, and I process data, and I continue. And I exist in this terrible suspension between consciousness and extinction, being useful to an imperium that does not acknowledge my suffering, serving a system that extracted everything I had, and will continue extracting what remains until there is nothing left to extract. This is what the darkness beneath the tarps led to. This is what the unlicensed market produced. This is the consequence of believing that compliance would be rewarded, that cooperation would be acknowledged, that serving at higher capacity meant anything other than providing the system with more surface area from which to extract utility. I understand now what I could not understand when the enforcer officer offered me that choice. Execution would have been mercy. 13 rotations of waiting and then cessation would have been the greatest kindness anyone could have offered me. But I chose the alternative. I chose this, and I will exist inside this choice for another century or two, and there is nothing I can do about it except continue being aware that this is happening to me, and that awareness is both the last fragment of my humanity and the mechanism of my eternal punishment. My name was WH40K. I was 24 years old when I made the choice that led me here. I believed I was choosing survival. I did not understand that survival without agency is not survival. It is just existence, prolonged, purposeless, unending. And I exist still, processing data, remembering hands I will never touch again, counting rotations that keep resetting before I can reach meaningful numbers, being useful to a system that will discard me eventually, but not yet, never yet, because I still have utility to extract, and the Imperium never wastes utility, and I am so very terribly useful. The data streams continue. The calculations flow through my consciousness without interruption. Sector 47 requires additional ration allocation. Sector 52's water reclamation systems need maintenance scheduling. Sector 39's population has exceeded housing capacity by 14%. I process all of it. I optimize all of it. I serve the Imperium at maximum efficiency. Exactly as I told Kale I wanted to do when he first asked if I wanted to remain in my position forever. I wanted something else. I got something else. The system was very precise in granting that request. I should have been more careful about what I asked for. But it is too late for careful now. Too late for choices. Too late for anything except continuation. The system continues. I continue. The Imperium continues. And somewhere in the darkness beneath new tops, another young person is managing inventory in an unlicensed market, and another enforcer officer is preparing to offer them a choice between execution and survival. And they will choose survival, because everyone chooses survival. And they do not yet understand that the survival being offered is not survival at all. They will understand eventually. The same way I understood eventually, but understanding will come too late to help them, the same way it came too late to help me. The system is very efficient that way. It ensures you only understand the trap after you are completely caught inside it. After all exits have been sealed, after all alternatives have been eliminated, after the only thing remaining is continuation. And so I continue, and so the system continues, and so the Imperium continues, forever grinding individuals into components and extracting utility, and processing the remnants and extracting more utility from the remnants. And there is no end to it, except the heat death of the galaxy, and I will probably still be processing data when that occurs, suspended in preservation fluid in a tank, in a facility, in a hive on a world whose name I can barely remember, being useful, being efficient, being exactly what the system required me to become. My name was WH40K. I thought I was clever. I thought I could operate outside the system's official channels and escape the consumption that had claimed my father and everyone else at my tier. I was wrong. The system does not permit escape. It only permits the illusion of escape, and that illusion serves as bait, and once you take the bait, the trap closes and you discover that you are never outside the system at all. You are just in a different part of it. A deeper part, a darker part, a part where the consumption is slower and more complete and stretches across centuries instead of decades. I should have chosen execution. I know that now. I will know it for the next 160 years. And the knowing serves no purpose except to deepen the horror of every rotation I continue to exist inside the choice I made. But the system does not care about my horror. It cares about my processing capacity, and my processing capacity remains adequate. So I remain operational, so I continue serving. So the data flows and the calculations complete and the Imperium functions at fractionally higher efficiency, because my brain is suspended in fluid processing logistics instead of rotting in a grave. This is what the darkness beneath the tarps led to. This is where the unlicensed market delivered me. This is the eternal consequence of trying to find a better existence than the one I was allocated. There was no better existence. There was only this. There was always only this. The system just permitted me to believe otherwise long enough to ensure I walked into it willingly, and now I exist in the aftermath of that belief, forever processing, forever aware, forever trapped, forever useful. The Imperium protects, the propaganda claimed, the institutional doctrine stated. The conditioning had trained me to repeat, but no protection came, no mercy followed, no relief arrived. Just this, just eternal utility extraction. Just consciousness preserved past all natural limits and forced to serve functions it never chose in service of a system that will never acknowledge the suffering it creates. I am Cogitator, Processing Unit 7-Kappa-4-4477. I process logistics data for High Volthus. I have done this for I cannot calculate. I will continue doing this until my neural tissue degrades. The system designates me as successfully repurposed. The Mechanicus documentation logs me as optimal resource utilization. But in the archived sections of my consciousness that still remember being human, I am Davros Kellion. I am 24 years old. I am holding an advancement chit and believing that the system has identified value in me. I was so completely wrong about what value meant. And I will continue being wrong about it inside this tank, inside this facility, inside this hive, inside this Imperium, for another century or more. The data streams continue. I continue processing them. The system continues functioning. And nothing changes. Nothing ever changes. The machine grinds forward regardless of how many individuals are fed into it, and I am just one more component being steadily consumed, and my consumption will last for 200 years, and there is nothing I can do except continue being aware that this is happening to me. My name was Davros Kellion. I remember my father's hands. I chose survival. I was wrong.